The blizzard howled, a frigid, white fury that clawed at the homestead's rough-hewn walls, mimicking the turmoil in Alara's gut. She hadn't seen a storm like this since her father had, well, since everything changed. Outside, the world was a canvas of swirling snow and biting wind, a desolate beauty that matched her own profound loneliness. The light from the single oil lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the small room, making her feel even smaller, more insignificant. She huddled closer to the dying embers in the hearth, wishing for warmth that reached deeper than her chilled skin. It was a fool's errand, this life, she often thought, carving out an existence on the edge of nothing, surrounded by wilderness and the ghosts of her past. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper the names of those she had lost, those who had abandoned her, their voices a mournful chorus. Then, a sound, distinct from the storm's wail, a low moan, carried on a sudden lull in the wind. Alara froze, her heart seizing. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the wall, its cold steel a familiar, albeit meager, comfort. It couldn't be a beast. Too human, too raw. Her breath hitched, fear coiling in her throat. She had built this life on caution, on avoiding anything that could bring the world's judgment or its pain back to her door. But that sound, that it spoke of desperation, a plea she knew intimately. It was the sound of something broken, something utterly vulnerable. She hesitated, her mind racing through every warning, every reason to stay put, to let the storm claim whatever lay outside. But a deeper instinct, a memory of a time she herself had been left for dead, pulled her towards the heavy oak door. It wasn't bravery, not truly. It was a kind of unwilling compulsion, a desperate empathy she had tried to bury beneath years of solitude. She wrestled with the frozen latch, the wood groaning in protest. The wind immediately attacked her face, stinging her eyes, stealing her breath. She squinted into the swirling white, the world outside a blur of motion. Then she saw him, a man, barely visible against the snowdrifts, collapse near the edge of her meager porch, his form indistinct beneath the white blanket already gathering on him. He was large, unmoving, a dark silhouette against the relentless white. Her initial fear sharpened into a cold dread. He was a Blackfoot warrior, she realized, the sight of his intricate braids and fringed buckskin chilling her to the bone. Her neighbors, if they ever found out, the shame would be unbearable. She knew the whispers, the accusations that followed her even now, years after she fled the town. She didn't need another reason for their judgment. He was bleeding, she saw then, a dark stain blossoming on the pristine snow beneath him, a wound, deep and cruel, on his side. He was clearly fading, his breath shallow, ragged gasps against the biting cold. Her mind screamed, danger. Her heart whispered kindness. The two fought a silent, brutal battle within her. He was an enemy, or so her world proclaimed, but he was also a man, dying, unwanted in this frozen wasteland. The choice, though terrifying, began to solidify. This wasn't about right or wrong in the eyes of others. It was about survival, a human decency she hadn't thought she still possessed. This was the moment. She felt the heavy burden of it, the weight of a decision that would redefine her solitude, for better or for worse. She knelt, her gloved hand trembling as she reached for his shoulder. He flinched, a low grunt escaping his lips, but his eyes, when they fluttered open, were glazed with pain, not malice. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. She didn't look back at the warmth of the cabin, only forward, to the man slowly succumbing to the harsh embrace of the blizzard. Her fingers fumbled for a grip, muscles straining as she tried to drag him inside. Every moment was a desperate gamble against the encroaching cold, against the fading light in his eyes. She pulled with all her might, grunting with effort, her own breath coming in ragged gasps. The warrior was heavy, a dead weight, but she refused to let go. Her small cabin, a haven of lonely solitude, was about to become something else entirely. It was a choice born of instinct, not logic, a desperate flicker of human connection in a world that had forgotten her. Alara dragged the warrior inside, the biting wind following them for a moment, a stark reminder of the peril they had just escaped. She wrestled the door shut, its heavy thud echoing in the small cabin. He lay sprawled on her worn rug, his breathing still shallow, his face pale beneath the strong, dark features. The blood on his side was a sickening crimson against his buckskin. She stared at him, her heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What had she done? The question echoed, a stark and self-doubting query in the silent room. She was alone, utterly alone, with a wounded man who was supposed to be her enemy, a representative of the very people her community feared and despised. The thought of being discovered, of the townspeople finding her with him, sent a fresh wave of dread through her. Public shaming, she knew, was a far more cruel punishment than any law could mete out. Her hands moved on their own, driven by a deep-seated instinct she didn't fully understand. She fetched a basin of water, ripped strips of her cleanest linen, and began to tend to his wound. Her fingers, though trembling, were steady. She had learned to care for herself, for the occasional injury from a clumsy fall or a sharp tool. This was different. This was a life, fragile and fleeting, resting in her inexperienced hands. He groaned as she cleaned the wound, a deep cut that pulsed with a dark rhythm. It looked like a musket shot, or perhaps an arrowhead had been removed. She worked quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration, trying to ignore the foreignness of his body, the stark reality of what lay before her. He was not simply a wounded man. He was a monument to all the boundaries she had just crossed. Her solitude was a fortress she had built brick by lonely brick. After the shattering collapse of her old life, she hadn't known her father could be so cruel, so desperate. He had sold her like cattle, traded her freedom for a deed, a debt, a handful of worthless promises. The memory still burned, a brand on her soul. She had been young, barely a woman, her innocence stripped away in the dusty confines of a legal ledger. The shame had followed her like a shadow, clinging to her even in this isolated place. She had fled, running from the whispers, the pity, the cold judgment in every eye. She had built this homestead with her own calloused hands, driven by a fierce need for independence, for a space where no one could own her, no one could hurt her again. But the scars, oh, they remained. The warrior stirred, his eyes opening, meeting hers. They were dark, intense, intelligent, even through the haze of pain. He watched her, a silent question in their depths. Elara swallowed, her own vulnerability exposed under his gaze. She offered him a small, chipped mug of water, her hand steady now. He took it slowly, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt through her. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch, yet it felt monumental, a tiny bridge forming in the vast chasm of their differences. He drank, his throat working, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no demand, no threat, only a weary acceptance. It was an unexpected moment of shared vulnerability, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken pact between them. She finished bandaging him, making sure it was clean, secure. He closed his eyes again, sinking into a restless sleep. Elara sat back on her heels, exhausted. She had risked everything for a man she didn't know, a man society labeled her enemy. She had let her empathy guide her, a dangerous impulse in a world that valued strength and self-preservation above all else. Her cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt strangely different, infused with the presence of another, a secret shared only with the blizzard outside. The air crackled with unspoken possibility and imminent danger. The choice had been made, and now she had to live with its heavy consequence. Her burdens felt heavier, yet surprisingly, not entirely unwelcome. This unexpected encounter had shaken the foundations of her carefully constructed isolation, raising questions she had long buried about belonging and the true cost of safety. Days blurred into a rhythm of hushed care and unspoken understanding. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, trapping them inside, a forced intimacy that defied the boundaries of their separate worlds. Elara moved quietly, tending to the warrior's wound, changing his dressings, offering him weak broth and the last of her dried meat. He was still too weak to speak much, but his eyes followed her, observing her every movement, a silent observer in her small, solitary existence. She learned his name, or what sounded like it, a guttural sound that he repeated softly, Kalen. It was a name that held the harsh beauty of the land, rugged and untamed. She offered him hers, Elara, and he repeated it, his voice a low rumble that resonated within the small space. Their communication was a language of gestures, of shared glances, of the quiet comfort of presence. She found herself talking to him, whispers into the stillness of the cabin, telling him about the hardships of her life, the unforgiving land, the relentless loneliness that had been her constant companion. She spoke of the harsh winters, the struggle to grow crops in the rocky soil, the constant fear of discovery, of the judgmental eyes of the few settlers who lived within a day's ride. She never spoke of the specific shame, the betrayal, but the raw emotion of being unwanted, of feeling utterly broken, was palpable in her voice. Kalen listened, his gaze steady, unwavering, offering a silent validation she had never received from anyone else. There was no pity in his eyes, only a deep, quiet understanding. The fever broke on the fourth night, his body racked with a violent tremor, his skin clammy. Elara sat beside him, cool cloths on his brow, coaxing him to drink water, her heart pounding with a desperate urgency. She thought of the wolves that stalked the edges of the forest, the bears waking from their slumber, the sheer, indifferent cruelty of nature. His life, so precariously balanced, felt like a precious thing she was compelled to protect. As dawn broke, a pale anemic light seeping through the single window, his breathing eased, and the taut lines of pain on his face relaxed. He slept soundly, deeply, a true healing sleep. Elara watched him, a profound weariness settling over her, but also a strange, quiet sense of accomplishment. She had saved him. The weight of that fact was immense. The external threat, however, was not just the wilderness. It was the people. She knew her neighbors, the scattered homesteaders, and the small, nascent town beyond the hills. They were suspicious, insular, quick to judge anything that deviated from their strictures. A white woman harboring a Blackfoot warrior would be an outrage, a moral affront. The thought of it sent a chill colder than any blizzard down her spine. She pictured the angry faces, the accusations, the righteous indignation. They would brand her a heathen, a traitor. Her carefully constructed life, isolated though it was, would be utterly ruined. This threat loomed, a constant, low thrum beneath the tentative peace they had found. Kalen began to heal more rapidly after the fever broke. He would rise, slowly, and move around the cabin, his strength returning day by day. He learned to help her, small tasks, fetching wood, stirring the fire. Their shared silence grew less burdened, more comfortable. He was a man of few words, but his presence was a powerful anchor in her lonely world. She found herself looking forward to the quiet hours they spent together, the companionable silence, the rare moments when their eyes would meet and a flicker of something, akin to trust, passed between them. She was still terrified of discovery, of the inevitable reckoning, but a new, fragile sense of safety had begun to bloom within the walls of her small cabin, an unexpected growth in the barren landscape of her life. It was a precarious peace, built on a foundation of shared secrecy and the undeniable, quiet truth of kindness. One crisp morning, weeks after the blizzard, Kalen was strong enough to sit by the window, watching the thawed landscape begin to show the first tentative hints of spring. The air was still cold, but the sun held a new promise. Elara, kneading dough for bread, found herself speaking of her past again, a deeper layer of the pain she carried. The words spilled out, raw and unbidden, as if the new warmth in the air had loosened the frozen secrets within her. She told him about her mother's death, the swift, brutal blow that had left her adrift, alone with a father who became a stranger, consumed by his own despair. "He changed," she whispered, her voice tight with remembered grief. "He looked at me, and he saw a burden, not a daughter." She spoke of the day he sold their land, their home, then her. Not with money, not directly, but through a binding agreement, a coerced marriage to a man twice her age to settle a debt. Her father sold her like cattle. The whispers had followed her, echoing in her nightmares. She had escaped that fate, but the cost was everything. Her reputation, her name, her meager inheritance. She had been left with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the burning shame of a society that condemned her for being a victim, not a villain. She didn't look back when she walked away from that town, her few belongings clutched in her hand, the dust of their judgment clinging to her worn boots. She just walked, until the world felt empty enough for her to breathe. She hadn't known where she was going, only that she had to be gone. Kalen listened, his dark eyes fixed on her. No judgment, no pity, just a quiet, profound attention that felt like a healing balm. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. When she finished, the silence in the cabin was heavy, pregnant with the weight of her shared past. Then he spoke, his voice low, a soft rasp. He told her of his own scars, not from battle, but from a different kind of wound. He spoke of the white settlers encroaching, of broken treaties, of his younger brother, swift and bright, killed by a drunken trapper's careless shot. His grief was a quiet, deep pool, similar to hers. He spoke of his people's land, stolen, their way of life under constant threat. He spoke of his own shame, the helplessness he felt as his people slowly lost their ancestral grounds, their very identity. In that moment, she saw the mirroring clearly. His tribe, losing their land, their traditions, their dignity. It was her own story, writ large, her forced abandonment, her loss of home, her very belonging stripped away. They were both survivors, marked by the world's indifferent cruelty, burdened by losses that could never truly be reclaimed. The tentative connection between them solidified, growing into something stronger, more resilient, rooted in shared empathy. It was a strange twist of fate that the man she had been taught to fear, the man who represented the other, understood her more deeply than anyone from her own world ever had. He saw her, not as the ruined girl, not as the outcast, but as someone who had endured, who had chosen kindness even when it meant immense risk. This sharing, this raw exposure of their deepest wounds, was an emotional risk for Alara. She had never allowed anyone this close, had never revealed the true depth of her scars. But with Kalen, the fear of judgment faded, replaced by a nascent trust. His quiet acceptance was a powerful affirmation. It was in these slow, deliberate exchanges that the foundations of a unique bond were forged, a connection built not on words, but on the silent recognition of shared pain and the profound act of listening without expectation. The world outside, with its looming threats and harsh judgments, seemed to recede, at least for a while. Within the safety of her small remote cabin, she felt, for the first time in years, not entirely broken. As the weeks turned, the snow receded further, revealing patches of damp earth, and the cabin felt less like a prison, more like a quiet haven. Kalen's strength returned fully. His movements were fluid, graceful. The raw power of a man healed, reasserting itself. He was no longer the helpless figure she had dragged from the snow. He was a warrior, a hunter, a man of the land. This shift was subtle, but profound. Their dynamic, once defined by her care and his need, began to equalize. He would bring back small game, a rabbit or a few fish from the thawing creek, contributing to their meager larder. He helped mend the fence that kept stray deer from her small garden patch. His hands strong and capable where hers were worn. A fragile sense of belonging began to root itself in Alara's heart, a feeling she had long since given up on. It wasn't a belonging to a community, not in the way she had once dreamed of. This was different. This was a belonging of two souls, finding solace in each other's presence, against the vast, indifferent wilderness and the judging world beyond. There were quiet mornings when they would sit by the fire, simply existing. The warmth of the embers a counterpoint to the still cool air outside. There were evenings when Kylan would carve small, intricate figures from wood, his concentration absolute, his presence a quiet comfort in the cabin. He never spoke of leaving, but the unspoken truth of his impending departure hung in the air, a bittersweet perfume. Ilara knew he couldn't stay. His people would be looking for him. Her secret was a ticking clock. The spring melt would bring trappers, prospectors, even other settlers further into the territory. The risk of discovery grew with every passing day. The moral tension was palpable. The freedom she craved, the safety of her isolation, versus the tenuous, invaluable belonging she had found with him. Could she truly keep him hidden? Could she bear to send him away? These questions gnawed at her, twin burdens on her already weary spirit. She had chosen kindness once, and it had brought her something unexpected. Now, she faced another choice, one that promised a different kind of pain. She watched him one afternoon as he sharpened a hunting knife, his face impassive. He was a tree, she thought, rooted and strong, enduring the harsh winds of change. She, too, had learned to endure, but her roots had been severed, leaving her adrift. With Kylan, she felt as if she was slowly, tentatively, growing new ones. He didn't offer a path to an easy life, but he offered companionship, understanding, and a quiet sense of respect. He saw her strength, not her weakness, her resilience, not her scars. This validation was a gift, a healing salve to wounds that had festered for years. She realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about integrating it, about finding a way to live with the scars without letting them define her. One evening, he finally spoke of it. "My people," he said, his voice deep, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky outside the window. "They will be looking for me." His words were not a request nor an apology, but a simple statement of fact. Ilara's heart constricted. She had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any less painful. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the things left unsaid. She nodded, her throat tight. "I know," she managed to whisper. The choice was not hers to make. Not truly. He was a free man, a warrior, with a duty to his people. But the thought of her cabin, empty once more, of the profound quiet that would descend upon her life after his departure, was a desolate prospect. Her tentative belonging, this fragile connection, felt poised on the precipice of loss. The day Kalen left dawned clear and cold, the morning air crisp with the promise of a full spring. He stood tall by the door, his hunting gear restored, a stoic figure against the rising sun. There were no grand farewells, no tearful goodbyes. They had both understood the nature of their bond, the necessity of its quiet end. He simply met her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or a shared sorrow. He offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of all that had transpired between them. Ilara returned it, her own heart a tight knot in her chest. She wanted to ask him to stay, to beg him, but the words wouldn't come. He was not hers to keep. He was a free man, and she, despite her past, believed in that freedom above all else. Then he turned and walked, a shadow melting into the nascent light of the forest, disappearing without a trace. Ilara stood on her porch, watching until the last hint of his presence vanished. The silence that descended was absolute, a profound void where his quiet presence had been. Her cabin, which had felt so briefly alive, now seemed to shrink back into its familiar, desolate stillness. The world felt emptier, colder. Despite the spring sun, she went about her chores, mechanically, her hands moving through the motions of grinding flour, tending to the small vegetable patch. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the weeks they had shared, the quiet intimacy, the unexpected kindness that had bloomed in the heart of isolation. The loneliness, which had always been a dull ache, sharpened into a raw, unbearable pain. She had opened herself, tentatively, and now the vulnerability felt like a fresh wound. She tried to busy herself, to lose herself in the monotonous rhythm of her solitary life. But every corner of the cabin held a memory of him, the faint scent of wood smoke and something wild, the small, unfinished carving he had left on the mantel, the way the light had caught his face when he laughed, a rare, soft sound. The weight of his absence was a physical presence, pressing down on her, threatening to crush the fragile hope that had taken root. She went to bed that night, the exhaustion a heavy cloak, but sleep refused to come. She lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar silence, haunted by the specter of what she had lost. The long night stretched, unending. She awoke with a start, not to the gentle light of dawn, but to a subtle shift in the air, a disturbance, an unfamiliar stillness. Her instincts, honed by years of living on the frontier, screamed danger. She rose, grabbing her rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved cautiously to the window, peering through the worn glass. What she saw made her breath catch, a gasp caught in her throat. The faint light of pre-dawn revealed silhouettes, dark and numerous, on the edges of her clearing. Not one or two, but dozens. The entire homestead was surrounded. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. It wasn't settlers. Their forms were too fluid, too silent, too much a part of the wilderness. It was Kalen's people. They were there, a silent army, their faces painted, their bows unstrung but ready. She saw their horses, their quiet patience. They weren't raiding, not yet. They were waiting. They were watching. Her secret, the one she had risked everything for, was exposed. The external threat, long foreshadowed, had materialized, more immediate and terrifying than she could have imagined. Her pulse roared in her ears. The choice she had made weeks ago, the kindness she had extended, now stood as the ultimate test of her courage. Her safety, her very life, hung in the balance. A thread stretched taut between two worlds. The quiet winds of the past weeks felt like a fleeting dream, shattered by this stark, terrifying reality. She was alone, facing a tribe. The sun began to climb, painting the eastern sky in hues of bruised violet and pale orange, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. Alara stood by the window, rifle in hand, her knuckles white against the dark wood. Her cabin, usually a sanctuary, felt like a trap, its single door the only point of entry for the silent figures outside. She couldn't see Kalen among them, and a fresh wave of fear gripped her. Had they come for him? Had they found him and learned what she had done? Would they see her act of kindness as a trap, a deception? The question swirled, a dizzying current in her mind. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. This was the moment she had always dreaded. The inevitable collision with the outside world, the judgment she had fled. A figure detached itself from the silent group, walking slowly towards her cabin. It was Kylan. Relief, hot and sharp, momentarily flooded her, quickly followed by a renewed surge of apprehension. He was unharmed, dressed in his tribal attire, a stoic warrior once more. He stopped a respectful distance from her porch, his gaze meeting hers through the glass. He said something in his own tongue, a low, resonant sound that carried across the still morning air. She didn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. He was calling her out. Her hands trembled on the rifle. This was her choice. Hide and prolong the inevitable, or face them, unarmed except for her truth. She hesitated, her mind flashing back to her father's betrayal, the helplessness of her youth. She had been sold, abandoned, without a voice, without a choice. But now, she was not that girl. She had built this home, survived this land. She had shown kindness, made a profound choice. She would not hide. With a deep, shaky breath, Elara unbarred the heavy door, stepping onto the porch. The cold morning air bit at her face. But she stood tall, her rifle held loosely at her side, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of her resilience. The dozens of eyes from the surrounding warriors fixed on her, an unnerving, silent scrutiny that felt like a physical weight. Kalen spoke again, this time turning to address his people, his words flowing with a quiet authority. He gestured towards Alara, then towards himself, his hand touching his side where the wound had been. He spoke of the blizzard, of the cold, of her intervention. He spoke of the kindness she had shown him, the way she had tended to his wounds, sheltered him from the storm, saved his life. His voice was steady, earnest, echoing with the raw truth of his experience. Alara watched him, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. Fear, certainly, but also a deep, quiet pride. He was honoring her, validating her choice before his own people. This was a testament to the trust they had built, a trust that transcended language and culture. The tension remained thick, however. There were whispers among the warriors, questioning glances. She saw doubt in some eyes, suspicion in others. The moral tension was palpable. She had crossed an unwritten boundary, inviting an outsider into her home, an act that could be seen as betrayal by both worlds. Her own community would condemn her if they knew. Kalen's people could condemn her for being white, for being an unknown. Her loyalty was being tested, not just to Kalen, but to her own sense of right and wrong, to the quiet dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. She met their gazes, one by one, her chin held high, determined not to show fear. She would stand by her choice, by the kindness she had offered. She was not broken, not anymore. Kalen finished speaking, his voice fading into the morning stillness. The air, thick with unspoken questions and simmering suspicion, hung heavy around Alara. The warriors remained silent, their eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on her. She could feel the collective weight of their judgment, the centuries of distrust between their peoples pressing down on her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat. She had faced down prejudice and abandonment before, but this felt different, more ancient, more profound. Her quiet courage was the only shield she possessed. She thought of her father, of the townspeople, of all the times she had been condemned without a hearing. This time, she would not be silenced. Then, an older warrior, his face etched with the lines of wisdom and hardship, stepped forward. His gaze was piercing, assessing. He spoke in Kalen's tongue, his voice gravelly, but Ilara understood the challenge in his posture, the weight of his words. Kalen responded, his voice firm, resolute. He gestured to Ilara, then to his own healed side again, a silent testimony. He spoke of the blizzard, of the cold, of how her home had been his sanctuary. He emphasized the word kindness, a word that somehow transcended their languages, its meaning universally understood. His words were a powerful affirmation of her character, her unexpected compassion. It was a simple act, a woman giving water to a wounded man, yet it had become a pivotal choice, a bridge across an impossible chasm. The older warrior listened, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It was a subtle gesture, but in the rigid silence of the gathered tribe, it felt monumental. A ripple of quiet murmurs went through the group. The tension, which had been stretched, taut, began to loosen, a slow release of held breath. Ilara felt a tremor of relief, a wave of lightheadedness. It wasn't a heroic triumph, no cheers, no grand declaration. It was a quiet win, an acknowledgement that resonated deeper than any fanfare. Her simple act of humanity had been recognized, accepted. Another warrior, a young woman with fierce eyes, approached, carrying a small, intricately beaded pouch. She offered it to Ilara, her expression solemn. Ilara hesitated, unsure. Kalen stepped forward, speaking softly in his tongue, explaining, it was a gift, a symbol of gratitude, of their understanding, a peace offering. Ilara took it, her fingers brushing the soft leather, the beads cool beneath her touch. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement of her bravery and her compassion. The shame that had clung to her for so long began to loosen its grip, dissolving in the warmth of this unexpected affirmation. She wasn't unwanted here. She wasn't a burden. The tribal leader, the wise elder, approached her now. He looked at her, then at Kalen, then back at her, a long, thoughtful gaze. He spoke to her directly, slowly, in broken English, a few words she understood. She brought healing, he said, his voice deep and raspy. She showed heart. He paused, then gestured to the surrounding land, to the homestead. You are here. Now, we know. It wasn't an invitation, not exactly. It was a quiet statement of fact, a reluctant acceptance. A new kind of safety settled over Ilara, one that came not from isolation, but from recognition. She had chosen to stay, to face the unknown, and in doing so, had found a fragile, unexpected belonging. This quiet victory, earned through a simple act of human kindness, felt more profound than any battle won. The tribe remained for a few hours, a silent, watchful presence, their horses grazing peacefully in the clearing. Kalen spoke with his people, his voice a low murmur, sharing the story of his recovery, the kindness he had received. Ilara stayed on the porch, observing, a part of their world now, yet still an outsider. There was no festive celebration, no elaborate ceremony. It was a quiet acceptance, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the harsh realities of their divided existence. The younger warriors observed her with curiosity, their eyes no longer hostile but intrigued. The older women, their faces weathered like ancient trees, gave her knowing glances, expressions that spoke of hardship and resilience, a common language she understood. Before they departed, the wise elder, the man who had spoken in broken English, approached her once more. He offered a short, guttural blessing, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. It was a powerful, wordless gesture of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of her spirit. Then, as silently as they had arrived, the tribe mounted their horses and rode away, fading into the forest as Kalen had done weeks ago. Kalen lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Ilara's. There was a profound depth in his eyes, a shared history in that single look. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The understanding between them was complete. Then he, too, turned and followed his people, a silhouette against the rising sun, leaving Ilara once again alone in her clearing. The silence that descended was different this time. It was not the oppressive, soul-crushing loneliness she had known before. It was a quieter, more reflective silence, imbued with the echoes of shared humanity and the memory of connection. Her cabin still stood, a small, isolated outpost, but it felt larger, infused with the presence of lives intertwined. The immediate threat had passed, and with it, a great weight had lifted. She had not only survived, she had been seen, affirmed, acknowledged. Her act of defiance, her simple choice to offer aid, had led to something unexpected. A fragile bridge built between two worlds, a testament to the power of kindness. Yet the implications remained. Her neighbors, the settlers, would never understand. If word ever reached the nearest town, the public shaming she had endured before would be magnified tenfold. She would be branded, not just as an outcast, but as a friend to the very people they feared. The moral tension between her newfound sense of self and the judgment of her own community would be a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of her life. She had sacrificed the illusion of wealth, of security, of an acceptable life, for this truth, for this profound moment of belonging. It was a bittersweet resolution, a peace earned at a high cost, but a peace nonetheless. Ilara walked around her homestead, touching the rough-hewn logs, the soil of her garden. The winter's scars were fading from the land, giving way to the vibrant green of spring, a metaphor for her own healing. The trauma of her past still lingered, a quiet ache, but it no longer defined her. She was not the desperate girl who had fled, nor the lonely woman who had simply endured. She was someone new, someone who had faced fear and chosen kindness, someone who had found belonging in the most unexpected of places. She had protected life, embraced risk, and in doing so, had found her own unwavering strength. The path ahead was uncertain, but she carried the indelible mark of a choice that had set her free, not from the world, but within herself. The spring deepened, unfurling its vibrant green across the hills, and Ilara found a new rhythm to her life. The quiet of her homestead was no longer a symbol of her isolation, but a space for reflection, for growth. Her hands still worked the soil, tended the fire, and mended her fences, but her spirit felt lighter, unburdened by the crushing weight of past shame. The scars, she knew, would always be there, etched into her memory, but they no longer dictated her worth. They were simply a part of her story, a testament to what she had endured, and more importantly, to how she had chosen to heal. She looked at the faint mark on her side where Kalen had touched her hand, the small, almost invisible scar that felt like a quiet blessing. She often thought of Kalen and his people, wondered if they were well, if their journeys were safe. She knew they lived somewhere beyond the hills, a world apart, yet forever connected to her by that single act of kindness in a blizzard. She had faced her deepest fierce abandonment, being unwanted, public shaming, and emerged not heroic, but quietly resilient. She had chosen to embrace the risk, to follow the desperate call of empathy, and in doing so, had unlocked a capacity for trust she hadn't known she possessed. Her life had been a journey from despair, through uncertainty, to this tentative peace. It was not a perfect peace, not one free of future threats or the lingering judgment of her own kind, but it was a genuine one, earned through profound emotional risk. The whisper of wind through the tall pines still carried echoes of loneliness, but now it also carried the faint, haunting hope of connection. She understood now that belonging wasn't about being accepted by a group. It was about finding your truth, about forging connections that honored your spirit, even if they defied the expectations of the world. Her family had failed her, her community had cast her out, but she had found a profound sense of self in the wilderness, and an unexpected belonging with a man from a different world. She had seen the raw kindness in a stranger, and it had reflected back a hidden strength within herself. Sometimes, she would sit by the creek, watching the water flow, relentless and constant, much like the changing seasons of her own life. The bitter winter had given way to the gentle spring, a promise of new beginnings. The past, like the melting snow, receded, leaving behind a refreshed landscape ready for new growth. She knew there would be future challenges, harsh winters, the ever-present threat of a world that didn't understand, the loneliness that could still creep in during the long evenings. But she faced them with a quiet resolve, a deep-seated affirmation of her own choices. Her cabin remained her sanctuary, a beacon of quiet endurance. She had carved out her space in the world, not by becoming fierce or independent in the way society glorified, but by nurturing empathy, by embracing vulnerability, and by extending kindness even when it carried immense personal cost. She was not broken. She was, in fact, more whole than she had ever been. Her spirit, once fractured, had been mended, not by external forces, but by the quiet, powerful choices she had made in the face of despair. Her journey had not ended with a grand triumph, but with a quiet, bittersweet understanding that peace was found not in the absence of scars, but in the courage to carry them, and to keep choosing kindness, always,